And we now have some time for discussion. You may write your questions into the chat. And if in addition to writing them down and me reading them, you prefer to ask your question yourself, then please raise your hand. If you raise your hand, please do write your question into the chat so that we could cluster around topics. As you go ahead and write down your questions, we will proceed with some questions and comments that people have made during the presentations. And I would like to start with two questions by Bob Blecker. One was a comment made during Marike's presentation.
Merike talked about earlier, which is the sort of lack of correlation of the policies with traditional political indicators. Because you have what is supposed to be a left-wing government in Mexico, albeit left-wing populist estilo AMLO, but this left-wing government, maybe not so left-wing, has pursued a general economic policy since AMLO came in of what he calls austeridad republicana, Republican austerity. No one is sure why it is Republican, but it is certainly austerity. And so there's been no, increase in fiscal spending to meet the tremendous fiscal needs of the country, no fiscal reform to provide greater revenue to the public sector. And even when AMLO has a historic political opportunity with his party controlling both houses of Congress and him having very high approval ratings, maybe they've come down, but in the beginning of his term. And so what it leads to is this just kind of unnecessarily horrific crisis where the government is simply not doing the things it needs to do to help the country and the economy during this situation. And I think it does support your argument, Merike, that this is not lining up with normal political indicators. So even the very feeble and weak response of the Brazilian government that Luiz Fernando talked about, and there's so much about it that's inadequate, and yet it has been better under a right-wing government than what Mexico did, which is casi nada. Gracias. Obrigado.
Okay. Thank you, Bob. So I think, Merike, do you want to reply first, and then we go to Luiz and José Antonio? Is that all right?
Yeah, I mean, I would just agree with everything that's said, and for traditional political scientists, there's a bit of a puzzle, here, simply, or for anybody who's an informed observer, that there is a left-wing government that has taken such an austere direction, and I mean, we're currently working on trying to understand that a little, and of course, part of it is simply AMLO's personality and what seems like somebody who is kind of stuck in the 1970s and is not able to update, and the fact that he has majority control of Congress. And so in this case, that's actually a problem because he has kind of sucked up the oxygen out of the left, and the right wing is not necessarily, the conservative opposition is not the place where they might be calling for more cash transfers. And so then you say, well, where would some criticism come from, right? And, because other countries like in Brazil and even in Chile, you had these more reticent governments, and then you had lots of pressure from Congress, and you even had protests in the street despite the Corona times, especially in Chile, just food protests, and the government reacted. And we don't see that same kind of process of pushing the government to do more in Mexico that we've seen in quite a few of the other Latin American countries that were initially reticent to move ahead with assistance. But I don't want to suck up all the space. We don't have much time, so I'll turn it over to other questions.
Thank you. Luiz, do you want to reply concerning the comments that were made about Brazil?
Well, let me actually reinforce the view on Mexico. That in fact Mexico, in my presentation, was also quite clear that it's the least. The government that has reacted the least to manage the crisis. Now, Brazil is interesting. Fernando basically told us that the Brazilian program, which has been one of the most active, in Latin America was because of Congress, not because of the government, right? I mean, maybe Fernando can clarify that, but that was my impression through his presentation. Now, in terms of results, it's quite interesting also because Mexico, in fact, is one of the worst cases of Latin America. It was particularly bad during the second quarter in terms of economic activity. Whether they are underestimating the coronavirus cases and deaths, it's a good question. I mean, I use the information that is available internationally, and that may be underestimating the amount of people affected by the virus. But I have no idea whether that is true or not.
Okay, thank you. We do have a number of questions related to capital inflows. First of all, several people have asked, why is capital still flowing into Latin American countries? Maybe, José Antonio, you can say something regarding the region. And Luiz, you've been asked, why is capital still flowing into Brazil despite historically low interest rates? Maybe we start from here, and then we have several questions about the consequences of these capital inflows. But let's first explain, why is this happening?
Excuse me, was my microphone muted when I spoke about Mexico?
No, we heard you.
Okay. On the capital flows, my interpretation is that it is really the result of the very expansionary monetary policy of the United States. Which is actually, according to the IMF analysis, much stronger than the policy it adopted in 2008, 2009. Actually, it's also true of Europe, but the US is more important because of the funding of emerging economies is taking place in the US in dollars. So I think it has been quite important. I think that's the basic reason for the strong recovery of bond markets, which is actually part of a broader recovery also of the stock market. Now, most Latin American countries have benefited, except those that do not have access because of being restructuring the debts or because they are not the market economy, let's say, in some way. But in any case, I think most of the countries have benefited in Latin America, not throughout the world. For example, Turkey and South Africa have been more affected than many Latin American countries. But Latin American countries, in fact, have had quite a good access, and that's, in my interpretation, is because of the Fed policy more than anything else.
Thank you. Luiz, can you comment on the specific situation in Brazil? Why is capital still flowing into Brazil, even though interest rates are so low right now? Let me unmute you.
What?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. The first is about why the capital is still flowing to the Brazilian economy.
Yes.
More or less, with a lot of movements. But in any case, I would say that in more generally for emerging markets, the problem of the regional C redux is that you have a much more sharp capital flights when we compare to, for instance, with 2008 rises. The capital outflows from the emerging market was much greater than 2008. So, but at the same time, as the capital goes, they return. Because why they return? So there is this sort of movement because the central bank of advanced economy implemented quantitative easing policies very strong. In the case of the United States, it was very strong action. So although in Brazil there is this reduction in the huge reduction did for historical levels of 2%, we could not imagine some years ago is to have 2% of policy interest rate. There is this reduction, but it's still, though it is, it can be fine for the global investor. But it's not only about the interest differential, but also it's about the equity market. That is, there is some sort of bubble. But begin with the bubble after since April, but again is the prices are reduction. So there is a very movement, very difficult to understand the movement that is very related to what is happening with the coronavirus in the world, with the second wave in the Europe, the impact that it has to emerging markets, and in the case of Brazil, there is also this sort of political problem related to the Bolsonaro government, including different segments, including environment, that impact on capital flows. Well, as for the second, there is another that is, Barbara is asking about modern monetary theory and the application.
Can we have this question later, Luiz? We will come back to it, but then we have some questions about the consequences of the capital inflow, so maybe we could have those first. Because several people have asked what will happen as a consequence. So, for example, Manuela Mahecha Alzate, sorry, and Hans Jokea have asked, will this lead to a balance of payment crisis, to debt crisis, and so forth? Will there be current account crisis? There's a question by Juan Gianni. This question was related to José Antonio mentioning another lost decade coming. So could you comment on what you think will the macroeconomic consequences be, or will it be possible to use capital inflows for economic recovery after the crisis?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, when you look at the meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank 3 weeks ago, one of the remarkable issues, and there were not many, I must say, but one of the more remarkable, there were two remarkable issues. The first one is this idea of no austerity. But in my interpretation, that was aimed really at developed countries, because developed countries can essentially finance the deficit at zero interest or even negative interest rates. So they said, well, yes. Now, emerging and developing countries cannot finance that way, and therefore they have more problems. But they are generally financing their, at relatively low interest rates anyway. Those that have access to the markets, including Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, etc., they can actually finance in relatively cheap terms. I mean, not zero, but 3%, let's say, for 10-year bonds. Which is quite low. Now, anyway, so austerity was more for the countries that can actually finance their deficits, so not all countries. And the second was the issue of debt. I mean, the IMF managing director and the IMF technical team put out some analysis indicating that, again, for developed countries, the perspectives in the area of debt are good. So with the recovery, because of the very low interest or zero interest rates, the debt ratios will peak this year, but they will actually decline. Now, whether that is going to be true of developing countries and emerging economies or not, is an issue in which the IMF had more skepticism. And actually, the managing director even proposed that there should be rethinking of the debt architecture. So I would say that maybe there are going to be a few more debt problems going forward. This year there have been surprisingly few, but particularly the crisis becomes very long. There might be more debt crisis coming in next year.
Thank you. Luiz, do you agree concerning the case of Brazil, or do you have different views?
Well, yeah, there are some specificities on the economy in terms of the balance payments that the deficit reduced a great deal, the trade deficit reduced, and mainly because of the recession of the economy, that the coefficient of the imports reduced. So there was a huge reduction in terms of the imports, and at the same time that the performance of the agriculture commodities export increased. So we out of situation, so that the deficit, current accounts, current deficit reduced great deal, and it can be easily financed by the foreign direct investment. But the problem is that this situation is a temporary situation that depends on the economy became stagnant. When if there is a recovery of the economy, well, we can have a problem. And one of the problems of the Brazilian economy is what is called the Deutsche disease. That Brazil has an agribusiness with a high productivity and very strong in terms of the costs of the exports, competitivity, but for the rest of the economy, the overvaluation of the exchange rate is very bad, mainly for the industry. Brazil is having this industrialization process very strong and sharply during the last 10 years. And I don't think that the government is, the implementation of the liberal reforms is doing anything to give the support for this.
Thank you. Thank you. We continue with two questions to Merike. Barbara, would you ask them yourself?
Okay, I hope my sound is good enough. Merike, many thanks for your presentation. As we've seen, this has been discussed, the amount and the breadth and the intensity of policy does not depend at all on political orientation, which is quite surprising. One would have expected leftist governments being more active and right-wing governments who are more passive, and we see a whole mix for everything. But what will tell us this about the potential continuation or institutionalization of this kind of policies? Because this also would be something we would expect more from leftist than from conservative governance. Where do you see the possibility of continuing this innovative policies, and where not, and why? And the second question linked to that is that Latin American countries are seen as countries with rather low state capacity and non-efficient public institutions. And what we see is that they have been very active and very quick in providing financial support for large parts of the society, which does not seem to be a result of inefficient institutions. What does it tell the crisis reaction as on the state of the state in Latin America?
Okay, thank you for lots of very good questions that I'll only be able to partially answer. So, I am actually thinking through the issue that left-right doesn't matter at all. That might not be the case, to be fair, to the extent that I think that partly, and we're digging through the details now, because one issue is also, where does the pressure for more transfers come from? And even like in Brazil, it was implemented by the right government, but it came from the opposition and civil society. Same thing of pushing for more broader and more sufficient transfers in Chile. Even though they were implemented by the right, the push more and more came from more leftist parts of society and Congress. Mexico, I think, is such an outlier that it might be skewing us to think that if Mexico doesn't do it, maybe the left doesn't matter at all. And I think we need to still work through that. Like, look at Argentina. And the truth is, like, for example, in Uruguay, the government didn't do that much in response to the new center-right government took over at the same time that the corona crisis happened. They've done a very good job overall, and Uruguay stands out as the one country that has had a very low death rate. So far, it's going up now. But they inherited such a strong social protection system from after 15 years of, a center-left government that the protection system was already there. They didn't need to do that much. Had it been a left-wing government, they probably would have the transfers would have been higher and more sufficient. So I think we need to dig through the details a little bit more. The case of Bolivia, now you just had elections and the left-wing government has won. The right-wing government, the transfers under Áñez were actually remarkably broad. They were actually quite insufficient. And the MAS that now won the elections was pushing for more sufficient transfers. So I think the devil is in the details, so I'm not ready to say that ideology didn't matter at all on that issue. In terms of what's going to happen next, we're following it. I cannot quite say yet, to be honest. That's an open question. I have some hypotheses, but I am working through them. On the issue of state capacity, this is actually revealing some weaknesses, and you said that Latin American countries were fast. In some cases, they were very slow. Peru is one example. The government said very early, mid-April, we want to give transfers to every household that has no income. Mid-April. It took them until mid-August to deliver the last transfers to 2.5 million households. So we're talking like 10 million people. So a huge chunk of Peruvians. That's how weak the state capacity and the existing registries were. They couldn't even find the people. Colombia has faced, like many countries have faced similar problems. So some countries that had pretty good state capacity off the bat were able to deliver those transfers faster. Other countries, this showed how weak they are. The one positive thing is, as the Peruvian government itself recognizes that, well, next time around, now we have those registries, and so we'll be better prepared. So there's significant variation on that.
Thank you. We do have a question that connects quite nicely by Lorenz Röttger, and don't be afraid, I'm not forgetting the older questions, but so Lorenz asked, referring to the view pronounced by José Antonio, but also I think by Merike, that redistributive fiscal policies are important and counter-cyclical policies are important, and that there should be further steps to fight the crisis. The question is it possible at all with the recent and current rise of populists? Or might they have been disenchanted by the crisis? He refers specifically to the case of Chile, asking whether there is hope with the last week's results. Maybe José Antonio and Merike, you can comment on the prospects of counter-cyclical and redistribution, fiscal policies against the backdrop of the rise of populism.
Well, let me point out that two countries that had a significant fiscal space to manage the crisis were Chile and Peru. Chile has a good tradition of doing countercyclical policies in the fiscal area in particular. Okay, so they did have a space, and Peru has been actually, in macroeconomic terms, even more conservative, let's say, historically, and they also had some policy space. Brazil actually a contrasting case, because Brazil had let's say a very large public sector debt. But again, from Luiz's presentation, it's quite clear that it was Congress that went forward with a very active fiscal policy rather than the government, which wanted probably more reforms, according to his presentation. Now, let me say, knowing Chile, I'm not sure they're going to populism in any way. I mean, I participated in many debates about the forthcoming referendum that has already happened, and the Constitution. Constitutional Assembly, actually presenting the case of Colombia, which had a similar process in 1991. And I'm very optimistic, actually. I mean, it is paradoxical, really, that Chile went through several decades of democracy with a constitution that was drafted by Pinochet. So I think it was about time to change that constitution. I mean, the only some reforms were introduced in the meanwhile, but not many. I mean, particularly President Lagos changed two important principles of the constitution. First of all, the fact that the president of the republic is the head of the armed forces, and not Pinochet, which was still at that time the head of the armed forces. And in the third democratic administration of Chile, and he also eliminated the designated senators, which was also a characteristic of that constitution. But many other issues in that constitution, I mean, the rest of the constitution remain in place. So I think Chile deserves to have a democratic constitution. I'm not sure I would call that populism for sure.
Thank you. Merike, do you also want to answer or comment on this point?
Yeah, the question was interesting. I didn't quite understand it, but I was also going to ask first, like, how do you define populism? Like, who is a populist, right? As a political scientist, I'm like, yeah, I would also agree that Chile is, what happened in Chile is an exciting moment of democratic re-enchantment, given lower and lower, turnout and all sorts of problems of democratic deficit that had been taking place despite the democratization. And so, it's more this unmediated, link to the masses, charismatic, leader who ignores horizontal institutions of accountability. And so I would not put Chile, in fact, perhaps one of the least populous countries in Latin America, along with Uruguay. But I see some more questions, so I don't want to. I agree with everything that Professor Ocampo said.
Okay, thanks for that. We do have a question by Valeria Jimenez asking about the future vision, so to speak, of José Antonio. Specifically, she asks whether you can explain and expand on the role of regional integration in the Latin American consensus that you mentioned, and specifically are aspects such as coordinated policies, for example, in terms of labor, tax systems, and so on, and the promotion of higher regional trade, part of the proposal that you have in mind?
Yes. Of course, the regional integration in Latin America has been a very frustrating process. And one point that I would underscore, in my analysis, is the fact that the integration has to be a commitment of the states, not of governments. In other words, the European Union works, in my view, because whether you change from left-wing to right-wing governments or right-wing to left-wing governments, you keep in the European Union. you are still in the European Union. Let's say in Latin America, there is a shift for one way in one way direction, and then the whole integration process may collapse. So I think the first thing, that's why I mentioned depoliticization. I think the integration has to be a policy of states. And of course, trade integration has to be one important element. It's a very particular element going forward, because world trade has been has not been very dynamic for 10 years already, since the 2008-2009 crisis. And it's unlikely to be much more dynamic going forward. So although there are opportunities, particularly trade with China, which many Latin American countries have benefited from, I think the regional integration has a new regional trade integration has a new space. But beyond that, there are many other things that should be integrated into the agenda. Let's put it some issues. For example, more common research and development efforts, the development of value chains, which are regional in character. And there are, very interesting opportunities in both areas. For example, in the area of medicines, we are extremely dependent, or actually medicines and medical equipment. We're extremely dependent as a region on imports of both medicines and medical equipment. There is a huge opportunity going forward in terms of, and some of them can be regional. Of course, there are good pharmaceutical capacity, let's say in Brazil, but the possibility of doing that as a regional process is quite important. So, tax cooperation. Now that most countries are in the OECD negotiations on international tax cooperation, there is a significant possibility of coordinating more the tax policies in order to avoid, let's say, the shifting profits away from the places where activity takes place. Anyway. So I think there's a good opportunity to expand regional integration, but particularly to depoliticize regional integration, without which nothing is possible in that area.
Thank you. We are now coming back to the MMT question by Barbara. Barbara, if you want to raise that question yourself. And let me just remark, I know that people can debate MMT for hours. We don't have so much time left, so I will ask you for relatively speaking brief answers to this question. Barbara, do you want to ask it yourself?
Okay, quickly. More and more economists in here are talking about the relevance of modern monetary theory, that the state can spend without creating inflation in a crisis such as this one. I personally have my doubts that this applies to peripheral economies like the Latin American ones. What is your opinion now about that? What is the end of the fiscal space of Latin American countries compared to, let's say, European countries? Thank you.